The snow fell thick over Ashford Manor that Christmas Eve, muffling the world in white silence. Inside the grand estate, a young woman stood trembling in the Duke's study, her dismissal letter clutched in frozen fingers. What His Grace didn't know, what no one in England knew, was that the governess he'd just cast out into the winter night was Princess Rosalind of Valmont, who had crossed an ocean and shed her crown to find the one man who'd saved her life years ago. The man who didn't remember her face, the man who just destroyed her last hope. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Princess Rosalind Evangeline Charlotte of Valmont had lived 22 years behind gilded bars. The Palace of Valmont, perched on the cliffs overlooking the English Channel, was magnificent in its beauty and suffocating in its expectations. Every moment of her existence had been choreographed since birth. The way she walked, the words she spoke, even the expression she wore when greeting foreign dignitaries. Her mother, Queen Marguerite, had made Rosalind's future abundantly clear from her 16th birthday onward. She would marry Prince Leopold of Brandenburg, a union that would secure trade routes and military alliances between their two small but wealthy nations. Leopold was 43, twice widowed, and possessed of a temperament as cold as the marble floors of his ancestral castle. Rosalind had met him only twice. Both times, his pale blue eyes had assessed her with the same detachment one might show when purchasing a broodmare. He'd commented on her childbearing hips and the strength of her teeth. She'd smiled through it all, as trained, while something inside her withered. The palace staff whispered that she was fortunate. Leopold was wealthy, titled, and politically powerful. What more could a princess want? But in the quiet of her chambers, Rosalind pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and remembered a different man entirely. She'd been 17 when the carriage accident happened. Her father had insisted on touring the northern provinces despite the autumn storms, and the roads had been treacherous with mud. The carriage had overturned on a remote country lane, throwing Rosalind into a ravine. She'd woken to find herself cradled in strong arms, a young man's face above her own, dark eyes filled with genuine concern. He'd been travelling through Valmont on some business she never learned, English by his accent. Perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and a scar along his jawline that somehow made him more handsome rather than less. He'd carried her to safety, stayed with her until the royal guards arrived, and then disappeared before she could even learn his name. But she'd heard the guards address him. "Your Grace," they'd said, bowing with respect. A duke, then. An English duke who'd saved her life and asked nothing in return. In the 5 years since, Rosalind had tried to forget him. She'd applied herself to her studies, to her royal duties, to preparing for her inevitable marriage to Leopold. But the memory of those dark eyes, of the gentle way he'd brushed mud from her face and told her she was safe now, haunted her dreams. 3 months ago, everything had changed. Queen Marguerite had announced that the wedding would take place in January, immediately after Rosalind's 23rd birthday. The contracts were signed, the invitations were being printed. Rosalind's life was no longer her own, if it ever had been. That night, her lady's maid, Marie, had found her weeping in the palace library. Marie was 60 years old, had served Rosalind since her birth, and possessed a practical streak that bordered on revolutionary. "If you truly cannot bear this marriage," Marie had whispered, "then you must leave. Now, while there's still time." "Leave? I'm a princess. I can't simply walk away from my responsibilities." "Can't you? Your brother Philippe is perfectly capable of handling diplomatic relations. Your mother has 3 other children. But you, my darling girl, have only one life. Will you spend it in Leopold's cold bed, producing heirs for a man who sees you as property?" The words had struck something deep within Rosalind. That night, she'd made her decision. She would find the English duke who'd saved her life. She would discover if the connection she'd felt in that moment had been real or merely the fantasy of a frightened girl. And if it was real, if he felt even a fraction of what she'd carried in her heart for 5 years, then perhaps she could choose a different path. Marie had helped her plan everything. They'd smuggled Rosalind out of the palace disguised as a servant, with enough money sewn into her clothing to survive for several months. They'd arranged passage to England under the name Rose Sinclair, and Marie had used her connections to discover the identity of the Duke who'd been travelling through Valmont 5 years ago. His name was Nicholas Ashford, the Duke of Thornfield, 30 years old, unmarried, and residing at Ashford Manor in the county of Derbyshire. He was known for his intelligence, his progressive management of his estates, and his refusal to participate in London's social season. He was also, according to Marie's sources, in need of a new governess for his 2 young wards. Rosalind had arrived in England 6 weeks ago. She'd secured the position at Ashford Manor through a London employment agency, presenting herself as Rose Sinclair, an educated young woman of good family but limited means, seeking respectable employment. The agency had been impressed by her fluency in French, German, and Italian, her knowledge of history and literature, and her accomplishments in music and art. Within a week, she'd been hired. Now, standing in the nursery of Ashford Manor on a cold December morning, Rosalind watched her 2 charges bent over their lessons. Lady Emma was 8 years old, dark-haired and serious, with her guardian's intelligent eyes. Lord Thomas was 6, fair-haired and mischievous, always ready with a smile. They were the orphaned children of the Duke's late cousin, and he'd taken them in without hesitation. The children adored their uncle, and Rosalind had quickly discovered why. Despite his reputation for coldness in society, Nicholas Ashford was patient and kind with Emma and Thomas. He took breakfast with them every morning, listened to their lessons in the evening, and never dismissed their questions as childish nonsense. But he didn't remember Rosalind. She'd been so certain that when he saw her face, recognition would dawn. Instead, he'd greeted her with polite formality, discussed her duties and salary, and then returned to his study. To him, she was simply Miss Sinclair, the new governess. Nothing more. The disappointment had been crushing, but Rosalind had not come so far to give up easily. She would make him see her, truly see her, and perhaps then he would remember. Perhaps then she could reveal her true identity and discover if the connection between them could become something real. She'd been at Ashford Manor for 5 weeks now, and she'd learned much about the Duke. He rose early and rode across his estates before breakfast, checking on his tenants and ensuring their cottages were sound for winter. He spent hours in his study managing accounts, reading correspondence, and meeting with his steward. He was fair but exacting, expecting excellence from his staff and his wards alike. He was also, Rosalind had discovered, deeply lonely. She'd seen it in the way he stood at the window in the evenings, staring out at the darkening grounds. She'd heard it in the careful distance he maintained from everyone around him. Something had wounded him, though she didn't yet know what. Yesterday, she'd finally gathered the courage to speak to him beyond their formal discussions of the children's progress. She'd found him in the library after the children were abed, and she'd asked his opinion on a passage from Wordsworth they'd been studying. He'd looked up from his papers, surprised, and for a moment their eyes had met. Something had flickered in his expression, a confusion, as though he were trying to remember something just beyond reach. But then his secretary, Mr. Pemberton, had entered with urgent business, and the moment had been lost. Now, as Christmas Eve approached, Rosalind felt time slipping away. The children were excited about the holiday, chattering about decorations and gifts, but Rosalind's heart was heavy with the knowledge that she'd soon have to make a choice. She couldn't remain a governess forever. Eventually her family would find her, or her money would run out, or the Duke would dismiss her for some unknown reason. She had to take a risk. She had to make him remember. Tonight, she decided. Tonight, At the Christmas Eve dinner, she would find a way to speak with him privately. She would tell him about Valmont, about the carriage accident, about the young woman he'd saved. And then she would see if the man she'd fallen in love with from a single moment of kindness was real, or merely a dream she'd been chasing across an ocean. The Christmas Eve dinner at Ashford Manor was meant to be a modest affair, but the Duke's sister, Lady Beatrice Hartwell, had arrived that afternoon with her husband and daughter, transforming the quiet household into something far more elaborate. Lady Beatrice was everything her brother was not: vivacious, social, and deeply invested in the intricacies of aristocratic society. She'd swept into the manor with trunks of luggage, a lady's maid, and immediate opinions about everything from the decorations to the menu. Within hours, she'd reorganized the seating arrangements for dinner and insisted that the governess would, of course, take her meal in the nursery with the children. Rosalind had accepted this demotion with outward grace, though inwardly her heart sank. Her plan to speak with the Duke privately was crumbling before it had even begun. She dressed carefully that evening in her best gown, a simple but elegant dress of deep blue wool that Marie had insisted she pack. She'd hoped it might remind the Duke of the blue velvet cloak she'd worn the day of the accident. Now it seemed the effort had been wasted, but as she was preparing the children's supper in the nursery, a footman arrived with an unexpected message. The Duke requested that Miss Sinclair join the family for dinner, as it was Christmas Eve, and the children would be dining with the adults as a special treat. Lady Beatrice had apparently protested, but the Duke had been firm. Rosalind's hands trembled as she helped Emma into her best dress and combed Thomas's hair. This was her chance. She would sit at the Duke's table, and somehow she would make him see her. The dining room at Ashford Manor was magnificent, with a long mahogany table set with crystal and silver that caught the candlelight. A fire roared in the massive hearth, and garlands of evergreen and holly decorated the mantelpiece. The Duke sat at the head of the table, with Lady Beatrice to his right and her husband, Lord Hartwell, to his left. Their daughter, Miss Charlotte Hartwell, sat beside her father, and the children were placed next to their aunt. Rosalind was seated at the far end of the table, as befitted her position as a servant, but at least she was present. She could see the Duke clearly, could watch the play of candlelight across his features. He looked tired tonight, she thought, with shadows under his dark eyes. But he smiled at Emma and Thomas, asking them about their lessons and their excitement for Christmas morning. Lady Beatrice dominated the conversation, as she seemed to dominate every room she entered. She spoke of London society, of the balls and parties she'd attended, of the eligible young ladies who'd been presented this season. Her daughter Charlotte, 19 years old and pretty in a sharp-featured way, smiled and nodded at all the appropriate moments. "Nicholas, you really must come to London for the season," Lady Beatrice insisted, her voice carrying down the table. "Charlotte has been invited to Lady Pemberton's ball in January, and it would be the perfect opportunity for you to re-enter society. You've hidden yourself away in Derbyshire long enough." "I have responsibilities here, Beatrice," the Duke replied mildly. "The estates require attention, and the children need stability." "The children have a governess," Lady Beatrice said, waving her hand dismissively. "That's what you employ her for, after all. And as for the estates, surely your steward can manage for a few weeks. You're 30 years old, Nicholas. It's past time you married and produced an heir. The title cannot die with you." Rosalind saw the Duke's jaw tighten, but he said nothing. Charlotte, however, leaned forward with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Uncle Nicholas, Mother is right. You can't mean to remain a bachelor forever. Surely there must be some lady who's caught your interest." "My interests lie in ensuring my wards receive a proper education and my tenants have sound roofs over their heads," the Duke said firmly. "Romance is a luxury I cannot afford." "Cannot afford, or will not permit yourself?" Lady Beatrice's voice had sharpened. "Nicholas, it's been 5 years since Eleanor died. You cannot mourn forever." The silence that fell over the table was sudden and absolute. Even the children stopped eating, sensing the tension. Rosalind's breath caught. Eleanor, a woman who had died 5 years ago. The same year the Duke had been travelling through Valmont. The Duke's face had gone carefully blank, the expression of a man who'd learned to hide his pain behind aristocratic composure. "This is not an appropriate topic for Christmas Eve dinner, Beatrice. I suggest we speak of something else." But Lady Beatrice, perhaps emboldened by wine or simply by her nature, pressed on. "It is precisely because it's Christmas Eve that we must speak of it. Eleanor was my dearest friend, Nicholas. I know how deeply you loved her, but she would not want you to bury yourself alive in this manner, refusing all society, rejecting every opportunity for happiness. She would want you to live. You presume to know what Eleanor would want?" The Duke's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the words. "You, who encouraged her to travel to Italy despite her weak constitution? You, who insisted she attend every party and ball in London, even when she was exhausted? You knew nothing of what Eleanor wanted, Beatrice. You knew only what you wanted for her." Lady Beatrice's face flushed red. "How dare you suggest that I suggest nothing. I state facts." The Duke stood, his napkin falling to the table. "Eleanor died because she pushed herself beyond her limits, trying to meet society's expectations. Expectations that you, among others, reinforced at every turn. I will not make the same mistake with my life or with the children's lives. We will live quietly, away from London's poisonous social circus, and that is final." He turned to leave, then seemed to remember himself. His gaze swept the table, landing briefly on Rosalind. For a moment their eyes met, and she saw such raw pain in his expression that her heart ached. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I have spoiled your Christmas Eve. Please continue your meal. I will take mine in my study." He left before anyone could respond. Lady Beatrice sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. Lord Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably and reached for his wineglass. Charlotte's eyes glittered with something that might have been satisfaction. Emma had begun to cry silently, tears rolling down her cheeks. Thomas looked frightened, his small hand reaching for his sister's. Rosalind made a decision in that instant. She rose from her seat and moved to the children, kneeling between them. "It's all right," she whispered, taking their hands. "Your uncle is simply tired. He loves you very much. Shall we finish our dinner and then go see if Cook has made those gingerbread biscuits she promised?" Emma nodded, sniffling, and Thomas managed a small smile. Rosalind helped them through the rest of the meal, ignoring the poisonous looks Lady Beatrice shot in her direction. When the children had eaten enough, she excused them and led them from the dining room. But instead of taking them directly to the nursery, Rosalind found herself walking toward the Duke's study. She had to see him, had to understand what had happened to Eleanor, and why the Duke carried such guilt. Perhaps in his pain, he might finally be ready to remember the day in Valmont when he'd saved another young woman's life. She settled the children in the library with a picture book, then approached the Duke's study. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see him standing at the window, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. She knocked softly. "Your Grace?" He turned, and she saw that his face was haggard. "Miss Sinclair, the children, are they well?" "They're in the library looking at books. They were worried about you." He closed his eyes briefly. "I should not have lost my temper at dinner. It was unforgivable." "It was human," Rosalind said gently. She stepped into the study, closing the door behind her. Propriety be damned. This man was in pain, and she would not leave him alone with it. "Your Grace, forgive my presumption, but I believe you've been carrying a great burden alone for too long." "You know nothing of my burdens, Miss Sinclair." "Then tell me." She moved closer, her heart pounding. "Tell me about Eleanor. Tell me why you blame yourself for her death." He laughed, a bitter sound. "You're very forward for a governess." "Perhaps. But I'm also someone who understands loss and guilt. I've made choices that hurt people I loved. I've run from responsibilities that terrified me. I'm not here to judge you, Your Grace. I'm here because She stopped. unsure how to continue without revealing too much. Because you what? He was looking at her now, really looking at her, and there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Because I believe you're a good man who deserves peace, she finished quietly. And because the children need you to forgive yourself so that you can fully be present for them. He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to speak warring with the habit of silence. Finally, he set down his glass and spoke. Eleanor was my fiancée. We were to be married 6 years ago. She was beautiful, accomplished, everything a duchess should be, but she was also fragile, prone to illness, and the demands of the social season exhausted her. I begged her to rest, to stay in the country, but she insisted on going to London, on attending every event. She said it was her duty as my future wife. He paused, his hands clenching. 5 years ago, she insisted on traveling to Italy with a group of friends, including my sister. I argued against it. The journey would be arduous, and Eleanor's health was already poor, but Beatrice convinced her it would be restorative, that the Italian sun would strengthen her. I was overruled. Rosalind's heart sank. She knew what was coming. Eleanor contracted a fever in Rome. By the time they brought her back to England, it was too late. She died 3 days after her return, in my arms, apologizing for being weak. His voice broke on the last word. She apologized to me, as though her death was a failure on her part, and I realized then that I'd failed her. I'd allowed society's expectations to push her beyond her limits. I'd been so concerned with duty and propriety that I'd forgotten to simply protect the woman I loved. So you left society entirely, Rosalind said softly, and you've been punishing yourself ever since. I've been ensuring that no one else suffers for my mistakes, he corrected. The children will not be pushed into society's mold. They will be educated, loved, and allowed to choose their own paths. And I will not marry again, because I will not risk another woman's health and happiness for the sake of producing an heir. Rosalind felt tears prick her eyes. This man, this good wounded man, had been alone with his guilt for 5 years. The same 5 years she'd been dreaming of him, building him into a romantic ideal in her mind. The reality was so much more complex and painful than she'd imagined. Your Grace, she said, Eleanor's death was not your fault. Illness is not something we can control, no matter how much we wish otherwise. And isolating yourself, denying yourself any chance at happiness, is not honoring her memory. It's simply another form of dying. He looked at her sharply. You speak very boldly for someone I've employed for barely a month. I speak boldly because someone must. She took a breath, knowing she was about to risk everything. Your Grace, 5 years ago, you were traveling through the kingdom of Valmont. Do you remember? His brow furrowed. Valmont? Yes, I was there on business shortly after Eleanor's death. I needed to escape England, to go somewhere no one knew me. Why do you ask? Do you remember a carriage accident? A young woman thrown from her carriage into a ravine? His eyes widened. Yes, I do remember. There was a terrible storm and a royal carriage had overturned. I helped pull a girl from the wreckage. She was unconscious, bleeding. I carried her to safety and waited with her until the guards arrived, but then they hurried me away and I never learned. He stopped, staring at her. Miss Sinclair, how do you know about this? Because I was that girl, Rosalind whispered. I was the one you saved. The Duke's face went pale. That's impossible. That girl she was Princess Rosalind of Valmont, Rosalind finished. Yes, Your Grace, that was me. And I've spent 5 years trying to find you again, to thank you, to... She stopped, unable to continue. He was looking at her as though she were a ghost. You're lying. This is some kind of scheme. Princess Rosalind would never be working as a governess in an English manor house. Unless she ran away from an arranged marriage to a man she couldn't bear to wed, Rosalind said. Unless she remembered the kindness in a stranger's eyes and wondered if perhaps there was another path available to her. Unless she was foolish enough to believe in fairy tales. The Duke shook his head slowly. This is madness. You expect me to believe that a princess abandoned her kingdom to become a governess, that you've been living under my roof for weeks without revealing your identity? Why? What possible reason? Because I wanted you to see me, Rosalind said, her voice breaking. Not as a princess, not as a title or a political alliance, but as a person, as Rose. I wanted to know if the connection I felt that day was real, or if I'd simply invented it in my desperation to escape my gilded cage. The Duke stared at her, and she saw belief warring with disbelief in his expression. If what you say is true, if you really are Princess Rosalind, then you've put yourself in tremendous danger. Your family must be searching for you. There could be international incidents. And you've compromised yourself by living here unchaperoned, working as a servant. I don't care about any of that, Rosalind interrupted. Don't you understand? I came here for you. I crossed an ocean, gave up my title, risked everything because I needed to know if we... She couldn't finish. The words were too raw, too vulnerable. The Duke's expression had gone cold. Then you've made a terrible mistake, Miss Sinclair, or Your Highness, or whoever you truly are. Because I am not the man you're looking for. I'm not a romantic hero from a fairy tale. I'm a broken widower who failed the woman he loved and who has nothing to offer anyone else. Whatever you thought you'd find here, whatever fantasy you've been nurturing, it doesn't exist. The words struck her like physical blows. Your Grace, no. He held up his hand. I don't know if you're truly Princess Rosalind or if this is some elaborate deception. Frankly, at this moment, I don't care. What I do know is that you've lied to me from the moment you entered my household. You've deceived me, manipulated me, and now you've created a situation that could destroy both our reputations. I cannot have someone I cannot trust caring for my wards. Rosalind felt the floor tilting beneath her. What are you saying? I'm saying that your employment is terminated, effective immediately. His voice was flat, emotionless. You will pack your belongings tonight and leave Ashford Manor first thing tomorrow morning. I will provide you with a month's wages and a reference, though God knows you don't deserve either. But I will not have you in my household another day. But it's Christmas Eve, Rosalind whispered. The children will be told that you had a family emergency and had to leave suddenly. They'll be upset, but they'll recover. Children are resilient. He turned away from her, facing the window once more. Please go, Miss Sinclair. We have nothing more to say to each other. Rosalind stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. She'd come here with hope, with dreams of a different future. She'd risked everything to find this man, to see if the kindness she'd glimpsed 5 years ago was real, and now he was casting her out into the winter night without a second thought. You're a coward, she said quietly. He turned back to her, his eyes flashing. Excuse me. You're a coward, she repeated louder now. You hide behind Eleanor's memory, behind your guilt, because it's easier than risking your heart again. You say you failed her, but the real failure is what you're doing now. You're not living. You're not allowing yourself to feel anything real. And when someone offers you genuine connection, genuine feeling, you throw it away because you're too afraid to be vulnerable again. Get out, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Gladly. Rosalind turned toward the door, tears streaming down her face. But know this, Your Grace, I didn't come here as a princess seeking a duke. I came as a woman seeking the man who showed her kindness when she needed it most. I came hoping to find someone brave enough to see past titles and expectations to the person underneath. I was wrong. You're not brave. You're just alone, and you always will be. She left the study, closing the door behind her with a quiet click that felt like the ending of everything. The morning of Christmas Day dawned cold and grey over London. Rosalind stood on the doorstep of a modest townhouse in Bloomsbury, her single trunk beside her, and wondered if she'd made yet another terrible mistake. The address had been given to her by Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper at Ashford Manor, who'd taken pity on the dismissed governess and whispered that if she ever needed help in London, she should seek out a Mrs. Agatha Pemberton. She's the Duke's great-aunt on his mother's side. Mrs. Henderson had said, pressing the address into Rosalind's hand. A bit eccentric, but kind-hearted. She takes in young women who found themselves in difficult circumstances. Don't tell His Grace I told you, but she'd want to help. Now, as Rosalind raised her hand to knock, the door swung open to reveal a tall, elegant woman in her 70s, with silver hair piled atop her head and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Well," the woman said, looking Rosalind up and down, "you must be the governess my nephew dismissed on Christmas Eve. Mrs. Henderson sent word by messenger last night. Come in, child, before you freeze to death on my doorstep." Rosalind found herself ushered into a warm, book-lined sitting room where a fire crackled cheerfully. Mrs. Pemberton, Aunt Agatha, as she insisted on being called, settled her into a comfortable chair and rang for tea. "Now then," Agatha said, once they both had steaming cups in hand. Mrs. Henderson's note was rather cryptic. She said only that Nicholas had dismissed you suddenly, and that she believed an injustice had been done. "So tell me, Miss Sinclair, what exactly happened?" Rosalind hesitated. How much should she reveal? But there was something in Agatha's direct gaze that invited honesty, and after weeks of deception, the truth felt like a relief. "My name isn't actually Rose Sinclair," she began. "It's Rosalind, Princess Rosalind of Valmont." To her credit, Agatha's expression barely changed. She simply set down her teacup and said, "I see. And does my nephew know this?" "He does now. I told him last night." Rosalind took a shaky breath and told the whole story. The carriage accident 5 years ago, her arranged marriage to Prince Leopold, her desperate flight from Valmont, her plan to find the Duke who'd saved her life. She left nothing out, including her foolish romantic hopes and the Duke's cold rejection. When she finished, Agatha was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "My nephew is an idiot." Rosalind blinked. "I beg your pardon." "An idiot," Agatha repeated firmly. "A brilliant, well-meaning, thoroughly good-hearted idiot who's been wallowing in guilt and self-pity for 5 years. Eleanor's death broke something in him, and he's never allowed it to heal. Instead, he's convinced himself that he's somehow cursed, that anyone who gets close to him will suffer. It's nonsense, of course, but try telling him that. He loved her very much," Rosalind said quietly. "He did, but Eleanor was never the right match for him, and I think part of him knew it. She was lovely, but fragile in more than just body. She needed constant reassurance, constant attention. Nicholas is the sort of man who needs a partner with strength, someone who can stand beside him rather than lean on him. Someone like you, perhaps." Rosalind shook her head. "He made it very clear that he wants nothing to do with me." "He made it very clear that he's terrified," Agatha corrected. "You challenged him, forced him to feel something again, and he panicked. But that doesn't mean all is lost. Tell me, Your Highness, what do you plan to do now? Return to Valmont and marry your prince?" The thought made Rosalind's stomach turn. "No, I can't go back to that life. I'd rather work as a governess for the rest of my days than marry Leopold." "Then you'll need a new position, and I'm afraid your lack of references will make that difficult. Nicholas may have given you a letter, but once word spreads that you were dismissed on Christmas Eve, no respectable family will hire you." Agatha tapped her fingers on the arm of her chair, thinking. "However, I may have an alternative. Do you know anything about women's education reform?" Rosalind blinked at the sudden change of subject. "I know that opportunities for women's higher education are severely limited in England." "Exactly. I'm part of a group working to change that. We're establishing a women's college here in London, a place where young women can study literature, mathematics, sciences and philosophy at a university level. We need instructors, particularly those fluent in multiple languages and well-versed in European literature and history. Your royal education would be invaluable, and your current situation means you're uniquely positioned to understand the constraints society places on women." "You want me to teach at a women's college?" Rosalind felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "I want you to help us build something revolutionary," Agatha said, her eyes gleaming. We're not just teaching young women to be better wives and mothers. We're teaching them to think critically, to question the world around them, to imagine different futures for themselves. It's dangerous work, in its way. We face opposition from traditionalists who believe women's minds are too delicate for serious study. But it's important work, world-changing work. Rosalind thought of her own education, of the tutors who taught her languages and history, but always with the understanding that such knowledge was merely ornamental, meant to make her a more interesting dinner companion for her future husband. What would it have meant to her to have teachers who believed her mind was as capable as any man's? "I would be honored to help," she said quietly. Agatha smiled. "Excellent. You can stay here with me while we get you settled. I have more than enough room, and I confess I enjoy the company. We'll begin after the new year. The spring term starts in January, and we have much to prepare." Over the following weeks, Rosalind threw herself into her new work with desperate energy. Anything to avoid thinking about Ashford Manor, about dark eyes and a cold voice telling her to leave. Agatha's townhouse became a refuge, filled with books and lively conversation. Other women involved in the college project came and went. Writers, reformers, blue-stockings who'd been dismissed by society as too intelligent or too opinionated. Among them was Dr. Elias Reed, a physician who'd studied in Edinburgh and who lectured on anatomy and physiology at the college. He was 35, with kind grey eyes and a gentle manner that put his students at ease. He'd been widowed young, his wife dying in childbirth along with their son, and he'd devoted himself to medicine ever since. He and Rosalind met at one of Agatha's dinner parties in early January. They'd been seated next to each other, and he'd asked about her background with genuine interest. She told him a carefully edited version of her story, a young woman from a wealthy European family who'd fled an arranged marriage to pursue education and independence in England. "That took remarkable courage," Elias had said. "Most people lack the strength to choose their own path when it means disappointing their families." "Or perhaps I'm simply selfish," Rosalind had replied. "I put my own desires above my duty to my country and my family." "Is it selfish to refuse to be treated as property?" Elias had asked quietly. "Is it selfish to believe you have the right to choose whom you marry, how you live, what you do with your mind and your talents? I don't think so. I think it's human." The conversation had stayed with Rosalind. Over the following weeks, she and Elias had become friends. He attended her lectures on French literature, and she attended his on medical ethics. They walked together in the park on Sunday afternoons, discussing philosophy and politics and the changing world around them. Elias never pressed for more than friendship, never made her feel that he expected anything from her. But there was a warmth in his gaze, a gentleness in his manner that soothed something raw inside her. He saw her as a person, not as a princess or a potential wife or a romantic fantasy. Just Rose, a woman with a good mind and a complicated past. "You're healing," Agatha observed one evening in late January as they sat by the fire after dinner. "When you first arrived, you looked like a wounded bird. Now you're beginning to remember how to fly." "I'm learning to live with disappointment," Rosalind said. "That's not quite the same as healing, isn't it? You came to England chasing a dream, and the dream didn't match reality. That's painful, yes, but now you're building something real instead. You're teaching young women to think for themselves. You're making friends based on genuine connection rather than social obligation. You're discovering who you are outside of your title and your family's expectations. That's not just healing, my dear. That's transformation." Rosalind wanted to believe her, but late at night, alone in her room, she still thought of Ashford Manor. She wondered if Emma and Thomas had found a new governess, if they'd forgotten her already. She wondered if the Duke ever thought of her, or if he'd dismissed her from his mind as easily as he'd dismissed her from his household. She'd been foolish to come to England, foolish to believe in fairy tales, but she couldn't quite bring herself to regret it. Because if she hadn't come, she wouldn't have found Agatha or the college or Elias. she wouldn't have discovered that she could be more than a princess in a gilded cage. In mid-February, Agatha announced that the college would be hosting a public lecture series to raise funds and awareness. Distinguished speakers from across England would present on topics ranging from literature to science to social reform. The events would be held at a rented hall in Mayfair, and members of London society would be invited to attend. "It's a risk," Agatha admitted. "We'll face criticism from traditionalists. But we need to show London that women's education is not a threat to society. It's an enhancement, and we need the financial support of wealthy patrons if we're to continue our work." Rosalind agreed to give one of the lectures, speaking on the role of women in European literature. She spent weeks preparing, reading and rereading texts, crafting arguments that would be both intellectually rigorous and accessible to a general audience. The night of her lecture arrived in early March. The hall was packed with curious Londoners, some supportive, others clearly skeptical. Rosalind stood at the podium in a gown of deep green silk that Agatha had insisted she borrow, and she began to speak. She talked about the women writers who'd been forced to publish under male pseudonyms. She discussed the female characters in Shakespeare and Austen who defied social expectations. She argued that women's voices had always been part of literature, but they'd been silenced, dismissed, or attributed to men. And she challenged her audience to imagine what might be possible if women were given the same educational opportunities as men. The applause when she finished was thunderous. People crowded around her afterward, asking questions, offering congratulations. Elias appeared at her side, smiling with pride. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "I've never heard anyone argue so passionately or so persuasively." "Thank you," Rosalind said, flushed with success. "I was terrified I'd forget everything I'd planned to say." "You didn't forget a word, you were—" He stopped, his gaze fixed on something over her shoulder. "Rose, I think someone wants to speak with you." Rosalind turned and her heart stopped. Standing at the edge of the crowd, looking uncomfortable in formal evening wear, was the Duke of Thornfield. Their eyes met across the room, and Rosalind saw shock and confusion, and something else in his expression. Something that might have been regret. The Duke approached slowly, as though uncertain of his welcome. The crowd around Rosalind had begun to disperse, sensing the tension in the air. Elias glanced between them, his expression thoughtful, then quietly excused himself. "Your Highness," the Duke said, formally bowing. "That was a remarkable lecture." "Thank you, Your Grace." Rosalind kept her voice cool, though her heart was racing. "I'm surprised to see you here. I didn't think women's education reform was among your interests." "It isn't, generally. But my great-aunt Agatha has been pestering me for weeks to attend one of these lectures. She said there was a speaker I needed to hear." His mouth quirked slightly. "She neglected to mention that the speaker would be you." "Aunt Agatha is very skilled at manipulation," Rosalind said. "It's one of her more endearing qualities." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. The Duke looked different than he had at Ashford Manor. Thinner perhaps, with deeper shadows under his eyes. He also looked uncertain, which was so unlike the composed aristocrat she remembered that it threw her off balance. "Might we speak privately?" he asked finally. "I owe you an apology, and I'd prefer not to deliver it in a crowded lecture hall." Rosalind wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell him that his apology came too late, that she'd moved on, that she didn't need anything from him. But curiosity won out. She nodded and led him to a small anteroom off the main hall. Once the door was closed, the Duke seemed at a loss for words. He paced to the window, stared out at the London street, then turned back to her. "I've been trying to find you for 2 months," he said abruptly. "After you left, I realized what a colossal mistake I'd made. I went to every employment agency in London, trying to discover where you'd gone. But you'd vanished. It wasn't until Agatha finally took pity on me last week that I learned you were here." "Why were you looking for me?" Rosalind asked, keeping her voice steady. "Because I was wrong. About everything." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she remembered from Ashford Manor. "That night, When you told me who you were, I panicked. You were right when you called me a coward. I was terrified of what I was feeling, terrified of being vulnerable again, so I lashed out. I hurt you deliberately because I was too afraid to admit that you'd gotten past my defenses. And now? Rosalind asked. What's changed? I have, he said simply. After you left, the house felt empty. The children were heartbroken. Emma cried for days, and Thomas kept asking when Miss Sinclair would come back. I told myself it was for the best, that you'd been dishonest, that I couldn't trust you. But the truth was, I couldn't trust myself. I couldn't trust that I deserved a second chance at happiness. He moved closer, his dark eyes intense. I went back through my memories of that day in Valmont. I'd buried them, tried to forget, because they reminded me of the man I'd been before Eleanor died, a man who believed in helping others, in kindness for its own sake. When I pulled you from that ravine, when I held you and promised you'd be safe, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Purpose, connection. And then I returned to England and Eleanor died, and I convinced myself that any happiness I felt was a betrayal of her memory. But it wasn't, Rosalind said softly. No, it wasn't. Eleanor would have been furious with me for the way I've been living. She would have told me to stop being melodramatic and to start living again. And you, Your Highness, you came halfway across Europe to find me, risked everything, and I threw it back in your face. I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. Rosalind felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Your apology is accepted, Your Grace, but I'm not sure what you expect to happen now. I've built a life here. I'm teaching at the college. I have friends, purpose, independence. I'm not the same desperate girl who showed up at your door, pretending to be a governess. I know. I can see that. You were brilliant up there tonight, confident and passionate and completely in command of your subject. You've become exactly what you were meant to be. He paused. But I'm hoping that perhaps there might still be room in your new life for me. Not as your employer, and not as some romantic fantasy, but as someone who sees you, truly sees you, and wants to know you better. Before Rosalind could respond, the door to the anteroom opened, and Lady Beatrice swept in, her daughter Charlotte behind her. They both stopped short at the sight of the Duke and Rosalind standing close together. "Nicholas!" Lady Beatrice's voice was sharp with surprise. "What on earth are you doing here? And with—" She looked at Rosalind more closely, and recognition dawned. "Miss Sinclair, the governess?" "Not exactly," the Duke said calmly. "Beatrice, Charlotte, may I present Her Royal Highness Princess Rosalind of Valmont?" The effect was instantaneous. Lady Beatrice's face went white, then red. Charlotte's mouth fell open in a most unladylike manner. "That's impossible," Lady Beatrice sputtered. "Princess Rosalind disappeared months ago. There was a scandal. She was meant to marry Prince Leopold of Brandenburg, and she vanished before the wedding. The whole of Europe has been searching for her." "And now you've found me?" Rosalind said, lifting her chin. "Though I'd appreciate it if you'd keep that information to yourself. I have no intention of returning to Valmont or marrying Prince Leopold." "But you must!" Charlotte burst out. "You can't simply abandon your responsibilities." "You're a princess. I'm a person," Rosalind corrected, "and I have the right to choose my own path, just as you do." "But the scandal," Lady Beatrice said weakly. "Your family must be frantic, and you've been living here, unchaperoned, working as a teacher. Your reputation is ruined." "My reputation in Valmont, perhaps, but here in London I'm simply Miss Rose Sinclair, an instructor at a women's college, and I'm quite content with that." Lady Beatrice turned to her nephew. "Nicholas, surely you see the impropriety of this situation. If it becomes known that you dismissed a princess from your household, that you've been meeting with her privately, then society will gossip, as it always does," the Duke said firmly. "But I don't particularly care what society thinks, Beatrice. I stopped caring about that 5 years ago." "But Charlotte," Lady Beatrice gestured to her daughter, "we've been introducing her to eligible gentlemen all season. If there's a scandal attached to our family, her prospects will be damaged." "Mother, please," Charlotte said, her voice tight. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own prospects, and frankly, I find this situation fascinating. A princess disguised as a governess? It's like something from a novel." She looked at Rosalind with new interest, and Rosalind saw calculation in her eyes. Charlotte was ambitious, that much was clear. And she just realized that knowing a runaway princess might be socially advantageous. "Your Highness," Charlotte said, "I wonder if you might consider giving another lecture, perhaps on the differences between women's education in Valmont and in England. I'm sure London society would be fascinated to hear a royal perspective." "I'm not interested in being a curiosity," Rosalind said coolly. "I'm interested in advancing women's education. If you're genuinely interested in that cause, Miss Hartwell, then I'd be happy to discuss it further, but I won't be put on display." Charlotte's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, I understand." Lady Beatrice had recovered some of her composure. "Nicholas, we need to discuss this privately. There are implications you may not have considered." "There's nothing to discuss, Beatrice." The Duke's voice was firm. "I'm not a child who needs your guidance. I'm a grown man making my own decisions. Now, if you'll excuse us, I was in the middle of a private conversation with Her Highness." Lady Beatrice looked as though she wanted to argue, but something in her nephew's expression stopped her. She nodded stiffly and swept from the room, Charlotte following with one last curious glance at Rosalind. When they were alone again, the Duke let out a long breath. "I apologize for my sister. She means well, but she has difficulty accepting that others might not share her priorities." "She's worried about you," Rosalind said, "and about Charlotte's prospects. I can understand that, even if I don't agree with her methods." "You're generous." He moved closer again. "Rosalind, may I call you Rosalind?" "Yes." "Rosalind, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'm asking anyway. Would you allow me to court you properly, not as a duke courting a princess, but as Nicholas courting Rose? I want to know who you've become. I want to understand your work, your passions, your dreams, and I want to see if perhaps what we both felt 5 years ago might grow into something real." Rosalind's heart was pounding. This was what she'd wanted, wasn't it? What she'd crossed an ocean to find. But now that it was being offered, she felt uncertain. She'd built a life without him. She'd found purpose and friendship and the beginnings of independence. Was she ready to risk all that for a man who'd already hurt her once? As if reading her thoughts, the Duke said quietly, "I'm not asking you to give up anything you've built here. I'm asking if I might be part of it. I want to support your work at the college. I want to learn from you. And if in time you decide that you might want something more, then I'll be here. But if not, if all you can offer is friendship, then I'll accept that too, because having you in my life in any capacity is better than the emptiness I've been living with." Before Rosalind could respond, the door opened again, and Elias entered. He took in the scene, Rosalind and the Duke standing close together, the tension in the air, and his expression grew carefully neutral. "Forgive the interruption," he said. "Rose, Agatha sent me to find you. There are several potential patrons who'd like to speak with you about funding for the college." "Of course," Rosalind said, grateful for the reprieve. She turned to the Duke. "Your Grace, thank you for your apology. I need time to consider what you've said. Perhaps we might continue this conversation another time." "Whenever you're ready," he said. "I'll wait." As Rosalind left the anteroom with Elias, she felt the Duke's gaze on her back. Elias was silent until they were out of earshot. Then he said quietly, "That was the Duke of Thornfield, wasn't it? Your former employer." "Yes. And he wants to court you." It wasn't a question, but Rosalind answered anyway. "He says he does." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Rose, I need to tell you something. I've been trying to find the right time, but there never seems to be a right time, so I'll just say it. I've developed feelings for you. Deep feelings. I know you may not feel the same way, and I don't want to pressure you, but I couldn't let the Duke declare his intentions without declaring my own." Rosalind stopped walking, turning to face him. "Elias, you don't have to say anything now," he said quickly. I just wanted you to know that you have options. The Duke isn't your only choice. If you felt even a fraction of what I feel, we could build something together. A partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. I know I'm not a duke, and I can't offer you a manor house or a title, but I can offer you my whole heart and a life where you'd be valued for your mind and your spirit, not just your beauty or your lineage. Rosalind felt tears spill over. You're a good man, Elias, one of the best I've ever known. But you love him, Elias said, his smile sad. The Duke, you've loved him for 5 years, haven't you? I don't know if what I feel is love or just the remnants of a fantasy, Rosalind admitted. But you're right that I need to resolve it before I can move forward. I'm sorry, Elias. You deserve someone who can give you their whole heart, not someone who's still tangled up in the past. I'll wait, Elias said simply. Not forever, perhaps, but for a while. And if you decide that the Duke isn't what you want after all, I'll be here. He squeezed her hand gently, then walked away, leaving Rosalind standing alone in the corridor, caught between two futures and unsure which one she wanted more. Over the following weeks, the Duke became a regular presence at the Women's College. He attended lectures, donated generously to the building fund, and engaged in spirited debates with the students and faculty. He was careful to maintain propriety, never seeking private meetings with Rosalind, always ensuring they were chaperoned. But his intentions were clear to everyone who saw them together. Agatha watched the courtship with satisfaction. He's doing it properly this time, she told Rosalind one evening. Learning who you are before making any grand declarations, that's the sign of a man who's grown up. Rosalind had to admit that she was impressed by the Duke's transformation. The cold, withdrawn man from Ashford Manor had been replaced by someone warmer, more open. He spoke passionately about his plans to improve conditions for his tenants, to establish schools on his estates, to use his wealth and position to create positive change. He listened when Rosalind spoke about her work, asked thoughtful questions, and never once suggested that her ambitions were inappropriate for a woman. He also spoke honestly about Eleanor, about his grief and his guilt, and about the work he'd been doing to forgive himself. I've been seeing a physician who specializes in disorders of the mind, he told Rosalind during one of their walks in the park. He's helped me understand that grief doesn't mean I can never be happy again, that loving someone new doesn't erase the love I had for Eleanor. That must have been difficult to accept, Rosalind said. It was, but necessary. I don't want to spend the rest of my life as a monument to the past. I want to live, truly live, in the present. And I want to build a future with someone who challenges me, who makes me think, who isn't content to simply be a decorative duchess. He looked at her meaningfully. Someone like you. But even as Rosalind felt herself softening toward the Duke, she was aware of Elias's quiet presence. He never pressed her for a decision, never made her feel guilty for spending time with the Duke, but she saw the sadness in his eyes when he watched them together, and it hurt her heart. In late April, everything came to a head. Rosalind received a letter from Valmont, forwarded through a series of intermediaries. It was from her brother Philippe, and it was brief and to the point. Rosalind, Mother is ill. The physicians say it's her heart. She's been asking for you. Please come home, even if only to say goodbye. Whatever anger you feel toward her, toward all of us, she's still your mother. She deserves to see you one last time. Philippe. Rosalind sat in Agatha's sitting room, the letter trembling in her hands. Agatha read it over her shoulder and sighed. You have to go, she said gently. You know you do. If I go back, they'll never let me leave again, Rosalind said. Philippe may be sympathetic, but Mother will insist I marry Leopold. The contracts are signed. I'll be trapped. Then you need to make a decision before you go, Agatha said, about what you want your future to be. Because if you return to Valmont as Princess Rosalind, unmarried and unclaimed, you'll have no leverage. But if you return as the Duchess of Thornfield or as the fiancée of a respected English physician, You'll have the protection of a husband and the backing of English law. Your mother won't be able to force you into a marriage you don't want." Rosalind looked at her in shock. "You're suggesting I marry for protection? I'm suggesting you marry for love, but with the practical understanding that marriage also provides legal and social protection. You love one of them, Rosalind. Perhaps both in different ways. But you need to choose, and you need to choose now before you return to Valmont." That evening, Rosalind asked both the Duke and Elias to meet her at Agatha's townhouse. When they arrived and saw each other, both men looked wary. "Gentlemen," Rosalind said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "thank you for coming. I need to tell you both something, and I need to do it honestly, even if it's painful." She told them about the letter from Philippa, about her mother's illness, about the pressure she would face to marry Leopold if she returned to Valmont alone. "I've been avoiding making a choice between you," she said. "Partly because I was afraid of hurting one of you, and partly because I was afraid of making the wrong decision. But I can't avoid it any longer. I need to return to Valmont, and I need to know where I stand before I go." She turned to Elias first. "You've been nothing but kind to me. You've respected my independence, supported my work, and offered me a future based on mutual respect and shared values. You're a good man, Elias, and any woman would be fortunate to marry you. But I can't be that woman, because as much as I care for you, as much as I admire you, I'm not in love with you, and you deserve someone who is." Elias's face was pale, but he nodded. "I appreciate your honesty. It hurts, but it's better than false hope." He looked at the Duke. "Take care of her, Thornfield. She's extraordinary." "I know," the Duke said quietly. Elias left, and Rosalind turned to the Duke. "Nicholas, when I came to England, I was chasing a fantasy. I'd built you up in my mind as some kind of romantic hero, the man who'd saved me and shown me kindness when I needed it most. And when the reality didn't match the fantasy, when you dismissed me from Ashford Manor, I was devastated. But I was also freed to discover who I was, without the weight of my title, without the expectations of my family, without the fantasy I'd been clinging to." "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry I hurt you. But I'm grateful too, in a way, because it forced both of us to grow, to become people who might actually be able to build something real together." "That's what I've realized," Rosalind said. "What I feel for you now isn't the same as what I felt when I first came to England. It's not a fantasy or a dream. It's something deeper and more complicated. It's love, but it's also frustration and anger and respect and hope, all tangled together. You've seen me at my worst and at my best. You've hurt me and apologized and worked to become better, and I've done the same. We're not perfect, either of us, but we're real." He took a deep breath. "So yes, Nicholas, if you're still asking, my answer is yes. I'll marry you. Not because I need protection, though that's certainly a practical benefit, but because I want to build a life with you. A life where we challenge each other and support each other and keep growing together." The Duke's face transformed, joy breaking through his usual composure. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hands. "You're certain? Because once we do this, once we marry, there's no going back. You'll be the Duchess of Thornfield, and that comes with its own set of expectations and responsibilities." "I'm certain," Rosalind said, "as long as you understand that I won't give up my work at the college. I won't be a duchess who simply hosts parties and embroiders cushions. I want to keep teaching, keep fighting for women's education." "I wouldn't want you any other way," he said. "In fact, I was hoping you might help me establish a school for girls on my estates. Proper education, not just needlework and deportment. Mathematics and literature and science." "You're serious?" "Completely. I've been thinking about it for weeks. We could create something revolutionary, Rosalind. Not just in London, but throughout England. Education for all children, regardless of gender or class. It would be our legacy." Rosalind felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears this time. "When do you want to marry?" "As soon as possible. Tomorrow, if we could arrange it. But I suppose we should be practical. You need to return to Valmont, see your mother, settle things with your family. And I need to make arrangements, obtain a special license, prepare Ashford Manor for a new duchess." He paused. "Will you let me come with you to Valmont? I don't want you to face your family alone." "Yes," Rosalind said. "Yes, I'd like that very much." They were married 3 days later in a quiet ceremony at Agatha's townhouse, with only a handful of witnesses present. Agatha cried, which she claimed was completely out of character. The Duke slipped a ring onto Rosalind's finger, a simple band of gold set with sapphires that matched her eyes, and promised to love and honor her for the rest of his days. "I promise to challenge you when you're being stubborn," Rosalind said, "to support you when you're struggling, and to remind you that you're not alone anymore. I promise to see you, truly see you, every day," the Duke replied. "Not as a princess or a duchess, but as Rosalind, the woman who was brave enough to cross an ocean for what she wanted and wise enough to build a new life when the first dream didn't work out." When they kissed, Rosalind felt something settle into place inside her. This was right. Not perfect, not a fairy tale, but real and solid and true. They left for Valmont the next morning, travelling as the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield. Rosalind wore a travelling dress of deep blue, and the Duke held her hand throughout the journey, as though afraid she might disappear if he let go. "Are you nervous?" he asked as their ship approached the Valmont coast. "Terrified," Rosalind admitted. "But I'm not alone this time. That makes all the difference." The Palace of Valmont loomed on the cliffs, just as imposing as Rosalind remembered. But she was different now. She wasn't the frightened girl who'd fled in the night. She was the Duchess of Thornfield, a teacher, a woman who'd chosen her own path. Her brother Philippe met them at the palace gates. He looked older than Rosalind remembered, with new lines around his eyes. But his smile was genuine as he embraced her. "Rosalind, thank God you're safe. Mother has been—" He stopped, noticing the Duke. "And you've brought a guest." "My husband," Rosalind said, taking the Duke's arm. "Philippe, may I present Nicholas Ashford, the Duke of Thornfield. Nicholas, my brother, Crown Prince Philippe of Valmont." Philippe's eyebrows rose, but he bowed gracefully. "Your Grace, welcome to Valmont. I must say, this is unexpected news. I imagine we have much to discuss," the Duke said. "But first, Her Highness would like to see her mother." Queen Marguerite was in her chambers, propped up on pillows, looking pale and fragile. But her eyes were sharp as ever when Rosalind entered. "So," she said, "the prodigal daughter returns, and married, I hear, to an English duke. How very dramatic of you, Rosalind." "Hello, Mother," Rosalind said quietly. "I'm sorry you've been ill." "Are you? Or are you simply here to gloat about escaping your responsibilities?" But there was no real heat in the Queen's words. She looked tired, Rosalind thought, and perhaps, underneath the anger, a little relieved. "I'm here because you're my mother," Rosalind said, "and because I wanted you to know that I'm happy, truly happy, for the first time in my life. I'm sorry I couldn't be the daughter you wanted, the princess who would make a politically advantageous marriage and secure alliances for Valmont. But I couldn't sacrifice my entire life for politics." "No," Queen Marguerite said softly. "I suppose you couldn't. You always were too much like your father, stubborn and idealistic, and convinced that love matters more than duty." She sighed. "Prince Leopold was furious when you disappeared. He's since married a princess from Bavaria, so that alliance is lost to us. But Philippe is more than capable of managing Valmont's diplomatic relations," Rosalind said. "He doesn't need me for that. No, he doesn't." The Queen looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Are you truly happy, Rosalind? This isn't just another rebellion?" "I'm truly happy," Rosalind said. "I'm teaching at a women's college in London. I'm working to expand educational opportunities for girls. And I've married a man who sees me as a partner, not as property. It's everything I wanted, Mother, everything I never thought I could have." Queen Marguerite closed her eyes. "Then I suppose I must be content with that, though I still think you're impossibly stubborn and dramatic." "I learned from the best," Rosalind said, and was rewarded with a faint smile from her mother. She stayed in Valmont for 2 weeks, long enough to see her mother's health improve and to make peace with her family. Philippe was genuinely happy for her, and even her younger siblings seemed to understand her choice. The scandal of her disappearance would fade, Philippe assured her, and her marriage to an English duke actually strengthened Valmont's ties to England, so perhaps some good had come of it after all. When Rosalind and the Duke finally left Valmont, sailing back toward England, Rosalind stood at the ship's rail and watched her homeland disappear into the distance. She felt no regret, only relief. She'd faced her past, made peace with her family, and chosen her future. "Ready to go home?" the Duke asked, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," Rosalind said, leaning into his warmth. "I'm ready." 6 months later, Ashford Manor had been transformed. The quiet, withdrawn household that Rosalind remembered from her time as a governess had become something vibrant and alive. The Duke had been true to his word, establishing a school for girls on the estate grounds. 20 students attended, daughters of tenants and local families, learning mathematics and literature alongside needlework and deportment. Rosalind taught 3 days a week at the school, and the other 2 days she travelled to London to continue her work at the Women's College. It was an exhausting schedule, but she thrived on it. She'd never been happier. Emma and Thomas had been overjoyed when their uncle married Miss Sinclair, or rather when they learned that Miss Sinclair had actually been Princess Rosalind all along and was now their Aunt Rosalind, the Duchess of Thornfield. Emma, now 9 years old, had decided she wanted to be a teacher when she grew up. Thomas, 7, wanted to be an explorer. The Duke encouraged both ambitions. On a warm September afternoon, Rosalind sat in the garden at Ashford Manor, correcting essays from her students. The Duke emerged from the house and settled beside her on the bench, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How are the essays?" he asked. "Brilliant, frustrating, inspiring, the usual." She set down her pen and leaned against him. "One of my students wrote about wanting to study medicine. She's only 14, but she's absolutely determined. She reminds me of myself at that age, full of dreams that everyone told me were impossible." "They're not impossible anymore," the Duke said. "Not for her, and not for any of the girls we're teaching. You've changed that, Rosalind. You and Agatha and all the other women working at the college. You're creating a different future." "We're creating it together," Rosalind corrected. "I couldn't do any of this without your support. The school here, the funding for the college, the way you've used your position to advocate for women's education in Parliament. You've been as much a part of this revolution as I have." "I'm simply following your lead," he said. "You're the revolutionary. I'm just the Duke who was smart enough to marry you." Rosalind laughed. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Your Grace." "I certainly hope so," he murmured, pulling her closer. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun slant through the trees. Then the Duke said, "I received a letter from Valmont today. From your brother Philippe." Rosalind sat up, suddenly alert. "Is Mother all right?" "She's fine. Better than fine, actually. Philippe says she's been working with the Valmont Parliament to establish a national education system, including schools for girls. Apparently, your example inspired her." Rosalind felt tears prick her eyes. "She's really doing that." According to Philippe, she told the Parliament that if her own daughter could cross an ocean to pursue education, then Valmont's daughters deserved the same opportunities at home. It's caused quite a stir, but Philippe thinks the reforms will pass. "I never thought—" Rosalind stopped, overwhelmed. "I never thought she'd understand. I thought she'd always see my leaving as a betrayal." "Perhaps she did at first," the Duke said gently. "But people can change, Rosalind. You've certainly proven that, and maybe by choosing your own path you gave her permission to reconsider her own beliefs." That evening, the Duke and Duchess hosted a small dinner party at Ashford Manor. Agatha had come from London, along with several of the college faculty. Elias was there too, accompanied by a young woman named Margaret, who worked as a nurse at his clinic. They seemed happy together, and Rosalind was genuinely glad for him. Lady Beatrice and Charlotte were also present, though their relationship with Rosalind had remained complicated. Beatrice still disapproved of Rosalind's work, believing it unbecoming for a duchess. But she'd grudgingly admitted that the school on the Ashford estates had improved the tenants' loyalty and productivity, so perhaps there was some value in education after all. Charlotte, surprisingly, had become one of the college's most generous patrons. She'd attended several lectures and had been genuinely moved by the students' passion and intelligence. She'd even begun taking classes herself, studying literature and philosophy. She was engaged now to a young baron who shared her intellectual interests, and she seemed far happier than she'd been during the London season. As Rosalind looked around the dinner table at the people gathered there, family, friends, colleagues, students, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. This was her life now. Not the life she'd been born into, and not the fairy tale she'd imagined when she first came to England, but something better, something real. After dinner, she and the Duke walked through the gardens as twilight fell. The air was soft and warm, filled with the scent of late-blooming roses. "Do you ever regret it?" the Duke asked. "Leaving Valmont, giving up your title, all of it?" "Never," Rosalind said without hesitation. "I gave up a crown, but I gained a life. My own life, chosen by me, lived on my own terms. That's worth more than any title. Even on the hard days, when the work is exhausting and the opposition is fierce and you wonder if you're making any difference at all." "Especially on those days," Rosalind said, "because on those days I remember the alternative. I remember what my life would have been if I'd stayed in Valmont and married Leopold. I would have been comfortable, certainly, wealthy and titled and respected. But I would have been empty inside, a beautiful shell with nothing real beneath." She turned to face him, taking both his hands. "Here, with you, I'm fully alive. I'm challenged and frustrated and exhausted and exhilarated, sometimes all in the same day. I'm making mistakes and learning from them. I'm building something that matters. And I'm loved for who I am, not for what I represent. That's everything, Nicholas. That's the whole world." The Duke pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not," Rosalind agreed, smiling, "but you're stuck with me anyway." "Thank God for that," he whispered, and kissed her as the stars began to appear overhead. Far away in Valmont, Queen Marguerite stood at her window, looking out at the same stars. She thought of her daughter, the stubborn, idealistic girl who'd refused to be confined by expectations. She'd been angry for so long, feeling betrayed and abandoned. But now, reading Philippe's reports of the school at Ashford Manor and the Women's College in London, she felt something else. Pride, perhaps, and a strange kind of hope. If Rosalind could choose her own path and find happiness, then perhaps other women could too. Perhaps Valmont's daughters deserved the chance to discover their own strengths, to pursue their own dreams. It was a radical thought for a queen who'd spent her life upholding tradition. But then Rosalind had always been a radical. Marguerite smiled to herself in the darkness. Her daughter had taught her one final lesson, that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of expectations, of control, of the future you'd planned, and trusting that the people you love will find their own way to bloom, even if it's in soil you never imagined. In London, Elias sat in his study, writing notes for his next lecture. Margaret had gone home for the evening and he was alone with his thoughts. He thought of Rose, Rosalind, and the life she'd built with the Duke. There was no bitterness in the thought, only a gentle melancholy. He'd loved her, truly loved her, but she'd been right to choose the Duke. They challenged each other in ways that he and Rosalind never would have, and Margaret was wonderful in her own way. Practical and kind and deeply committed to helping others, they were building something together, a partnership based on shared work and mutual respect. It wasn't the passionate romance he'd imagined with Rosalind, but it was real and solid and good. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was more than enough. At Ashford Manor, Emma sat at her desk in the nursery, writing in her journal by candlelight. "Today, Aunt Rosalind taught us about Marie Curie," she wrote in her careful script. "She was a scientist who discovered radium and won 2 Nobel Prizes. Aunt Rosalind says that women can be scientists too, if we work hard and don't let anyone tell us we can't. I want to be a scientist when I grow up, Or maybe a teacher like Aunt Rosalind. Or both. Uncle Nicholas says I can be anything I want as long as I'm willing to work for it. I believe him. In the master bedroom, Rosalind stood at the window, looking out at the moonlit grounds. The Duke came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Rosalind said. "How strange life is. How a single moment can change everything. If you hadn't been travelling through Valmont that day, if you hadn't stopped to help when my carriage overturned, none of this would have happened. I'd be married to Leopold, miserable and trapped. You'd still be alone mourning Eleanor. The school wouldn't exist. The college would have one less teacher, all the ripples spreading out from that one moment of kindness." "I've thought about that too," the Duke said. "How close we came to missing each other entirely. How many things had to go exactly right for us to end up here." "Do you believe in fate?" Rosalind asked. "I believe in choice," the Duke said. "I believe that we're given moments, opportunities, and what we do with them determines our lives. I chose to stop and help a stranger in Valmont. You chose to come to England to find me. We both chose to be honest about our feelings, even when it was difficult, and we chose to build this life together. That's not fate, that's courage." "Courage," Rosalind repeated softly. "Yes, I like that better than fate. Fate implies we had no control, that everything was predetermined. But we made these choices. We created this life, and we can keep creating it, keep choosing each other, every day." "Every day," the Duke agreed. "For the rest of our lives." They stood together at the window, watching the moon rise over Ashford Manor. In the distance, they could see the lights of the village, the cottages where their tenants lived, the school building where tomorrow Rosalind would teach another generation of girls that they could be anything they dreamed of being. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were still challenges ahead, still opposition to face, still days when the work would seem impossible. But they would face it together, as partners, as equals, as two people who'd chosen each other despite all the obstacles in their path. And that, Rosalind thought, was better than any fairy tale, because it was real, because it was theirs, because they'd built it with their own hands, their own choices, their own courage. She'd left Valmont as a princess fleeing a golden cage. She'd arrived in England as a governess chasing a dream. And she'd become a duchess, a teacher, a revolutionary, a woman who'd chosen her own path and bloomed exactly where she'd planted herself. The Duke pressed a kiss to her hair. "Happy?" he asked. "Extraordinarily," Rosalind said, and she was. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled.